The biggest member of the family Dromaeosauridae, the raptors, wasn't Velociraptor, it wasn't Deinonychus, and it wasn't even Utahraptor. It was an enormous predator that would have rivaled the Tyrannosaurs and Carcharodontosaurs of its day, and yet it's so mysterious it doesn't even have a name. I'm going to talk about this extraordinary creature and what it tells us about paleontology. So the Dromaeosauridae, popularly known as raptors, are this highly specialized group of bird-like dinosaurs. And dromaeosaurs had this huge, laterally compressed, hooked, sickle-shaped slashing claw on the second toe that they would use to dispatch large prey in much the same way that a saber-toothed cat would have used its huge blade-like canine teeth. So they're able to take down proportionally very large prey, even though a lot of these aren't particularly large dinosaurs. And they have a number of other just really unusual specializations, like a specialized tail that's reinforced by ossified tendons. And they've played a really important role in our understanding of dinosaurs in a lot of different ways. So our initial picture of theropod dinosaurs came from animals like Megalosaurus, Allosaurus, Tyrannosaurus, these these very, very large predators. And dromaeosaurs tended to be relatively small-bodied compared to them. They were more agile, they're very big-brained. And this really forced people to reconsider what we thought we knew about dinosaurs. That they weren't just these big, dumb, slow-moving things doomed to extinction, but that dinosaurs were highly specialized, well-adapted, and highly diverse group of animals. And this is part of the dromaeosaurs helped spark the dinosaur renaissance in the 1960s, where we started rethinking dinosaurs in their biology and their evolution. So the evolution of our understanding of dinosaur evolution really took a turn in 1969 with the description of the dromaeosaur Deinonychus by John Ostrom, along with this iconic illustration by Bob Bacher. And this contributed to a massive rethinking of dinosaur biology, and basically everything we thought we knew about dinosaur biology and also dinosaur evolution was reconsidered. And one of the big ways in which dromaeosaurs forced us to rethink dinosaur evolution was the extraordinarily bird-like nature of their skeleton. They look pretty different from modern birds, which are highly modified, but bone for bone, the skeleton of a dromaeosaur matches up almost perfectly with early birds like Archaeopteryx, and this forced us to reconsider the evolutionary relationships of birds and dinosaurs. So dromaeosaurs are incredibly similar to birds in their skulls, in their skeletons, and even, it turns out, in their feathering. They also have this specialized wrist bone called the semilunate carpal, and it's a hinge joint that allows the arms of a dromaeosaur to fold like the wings of a bird. And the extraordinary similarity in this wrist structure seemed very difficult, if not impossible, to explain in terms of convergence. They were just so similar to Archaeopteryx and other early birds, and it persuaded Ostrom that these animals were the closest relatives of birds, and that birds actually emerged from inside the Dinosauria. So it was this feature, but then also a bunch of other features that he noticed in the dromaeosaur skeleton and in the skeleton of Deinonychus, and additional work done on Velociraptor from Mongolia that helped us rethink the evolution of birds, the origin of birds, that they were in fact modified dinosaurs and very, very close relatives of the dromaeosaurs in particular. So the dromaeosaurs were really critical in helping us bridge this gap. They're kind of transitional fossils linking modern birds to more traditional dinosaurs, things like a T-Rex or an Allosaurus. As predatory dinosaurs, they've also captured the popular imagination. This is a group of animals that seems uniquely dangerous. They're agile, they're smart, they're relatively small compared to something like T-Rex, but very heavily armed. And so it's kind of natural that, when Michael Crichton came up with the idea for a story about dinosaurs run amok, that dromaeosaurs would feature heavily in that. So a lot of the popularity of dromaeosaurs comes down to the fact that they're stars of a popular media franchise, Jurassic Park. And so when Michael Crichton was writing the original novel, his science fiction novel, Jurassic Park, of course you have to have T-Rex as a villain because everybody loves T-Rex. It's big and it's terrifying. But a good movie often has a number of different villains as your primary villains and your secondary antagonists. And he made the Velociraptor the other villain. So T-Rex has size and brute strength, but raptors were faster, more agile, and more intelligent. If anything, Velociraptor is the real villain in the movie. They're actively pursuing people throughout the movie. There's nowhere they're really safe from them. So they're arguably the real villains of Jurassic Park. If you think of it in terms of movie tropes and how you write a screenplay, Uh, T-Rex is sort of the muscle, and Velociraptor's the brains. And this is like the old Bond movies, like the James Bond movies. You have your goons, guys like Oddjob and Jaws. These are very physical guys, and they attack you physically. And they have the cunning supervillain who kind of runs everything, and that's like Dr. No or Blofeld with his white cat. Velociraptor is sort of the evil genius of the Jurassic Park franchise. It's got the brains, and T-Rex has the brawn. Now, in the process of making the movie, some liberties were taken to make the raptors scarier. In Crichton's novel, the raptors were as intelligent as chimpanzees. In reality, they had brains smaller than those of an ostrich, an equivalent-sized ratite. These were not geniuses; they were bird-brained and not even, comparable to a very large-brained bird like a crow or a parrot. So they probably weren't nearly as smart as they were made out. And the other thing that's changed is that Steven Spielberg in the original Jurassic Park movie made them bigger to make them more intimidating. And if you look at the fossils, you kind of see why. Velociraptor is just not that big an animal. It's about 6 feet long. Most of that is tail. It's about the size of a coyote or a golden retriever. It's just not that terrifying an animal, so they kind of had to scale it up a bit to make it terrifying. A number of raptors, however, got substantially larger than Velociraptor. Deinonychus gets maybe about 3 meters, 9 or 10 feet long, and this corresponds a lot better to the Velociraptor of the movie. And yet, as we've started finding more and more of these animals and learning more about the diversity of dromaeosaurs, we've started to find that a number of raptors got considerably larger. One of these animals is Utah Raptor from the Cedar Mountain Formation of Utah. And this is, among dromaeosaurs, a giant. It's about 7 meters long. It's, over 20-something feet and maybe 700 kilograms in mass. This is bigger than a Siberian tiger, about the size of a polar bear. And various mass estimates have been put forward because a number of different specimens have been found in bone beds. We don't have like a single really good skeleton of these animals. Most of the estimates are at the lower range, something around 300 kilograms. But a number of individuals got even larger than that. One has a mass estimate putting it around 777 kilograms. So some of these things start getting really, really big. They're starting to push towards the lower end of the Tyrannosaur range. Another big raptor that was discovered after Utah Raptor was a Chelobator from the Cenomanian Turonian of Mongolia. It seems to be a relative of a Utah Raptor. It has a very similar construction of the skeleton in a lot of ways. And there's it's been unclear exactly what these animals are. I've talked this over with Jim Kirkland, who described Utah Raptor, and he kept hammering home how they lack the ossified tendons in the tail seen in typical dromaeosaurs, things like Velociraptor and Deinonychus and things like that, and in Sornitholistines. I thought he was kind of making a bit much of it, but the more I looked into it, I think he's correct and onto something. These large-bodied, robust dromaeosaurs that we're getting in the early Cretaceous of Utah and then in the middle Cretaceous in Asia, I think they might be a distinct group. They're not part of the they might not even be part of the Eudromaeosauri at all. I don't think they're dromaeosaurians. I guess we would call this group the Utah Raptorinae, and they seem to be something different anyway, kind of a separate lineage, and Dromaeosaurus is kind of off doing its own thing. A Chelobator gets pretty big as well, not quite as big as Utah Raptor as far as we know. It gets about 5 meters or 16 feet long, and it weighs maybe 450 kilograms. Fairly recently, we've had the discovery of Dakota Raptor. This animal is known from an associated skeleton from the Hell Creek Formation of South Dakota. It gets to around 6 meters or 18 feet long and maybe 350 kilograms. It's large and long, but it's fairly gracile. The limbs on this thing are surprisingly lanky for such a big dromaeosaur. So it's built in a very, very different way than the Utah Raptorines, which is, these things are, Utah Raptorines are built like tanks. Like, I don't know what they're doing. They're so robust. Like, if they're hunting sauropods or ankylosaurs or something, but they've got a very distinct strategy. As far as, well, what is Dakota Raptor? It has big denticles on the teeth, which is a dromaeosaurian feature. The sickle claw is really strongly curved like in dromaeosaurines. It has these long ossified tendons in the tail, which makes it a eudromaeosaur. So we got a number of clades it could be part of. Dromaeosaurinae, Sornitholistinae, Velociraptorinae that have these ossified tendons. But in general, the anatomy seems to conform well with that of Dromaeosaurus and Deinonychus, suggesting that we have a dromaeosaurine. And this is kind of interesting because Dakota Raptor is part of this really diverse predator fauna that we have in the Hell Creek. So we have Dakota Raptor, we have another Dromaeosaur called a Raptor in the Hell Creek. We have Nanotyrannus, probably Stygianator, another Nanotyrannosaur, and then T-Rex. So it is one of at least 5 different predatory dinosaurs running around simultaneously in the Hell Creek. And then we have discovery fairly recently in South America of an animal called Austroraptor. And it's part of a distinct group of dromaeosaurs. I mean, they're quite different, and some people aren't even convinced they are dromaeosaurs. For the sake of this talk, we'll assume that they are, but that's a bit up in the air. This is a group called the Unenlagiinae. It's related to Unenlagia. And Unenlagians are known from the Cretaceous of South America, likely Europe. Madagascar, Rahunavis appears to be an Unenlagian, possibly Africa, a few scraps. And the Unenlagians independently evolved large size at the end of the Cretaceous. But they're doing something very, very different than the other dromaeosaurs. They have these very long, slender jaws. They have these very tiny little teeth in there. So I don't know if they're hunting small animals or fish. Maybe there's some type of omnivore, like a crane that's eating vegetation, small animals. But they don't seem to be apex predators. They're doing something very different than, say, a Utah raptor would be doing. And these guys get pretty big as well. They get something like maybe 6 meters, 20 feet long, and their mass estimates of around 500 kilograms for these things. So about 1,000 pounds. They're pretty big animals. So we're seeing a number of different lineages getting to large size. Utah raptorines, dromaeosaurines, and the Unenlagians. So which is the biggest? Is it Utah Raptor? Is it Chelabator? Is it Dakota Raptor? Is it Austroraptor? It's none of these. I don't think it's any of these things. There is an even larger dromaeosaur out there, and I kind of discovered this animal going through the literature. At the time, I was describing a dromaeosaur from England called Vectoraptor, and it's just going through, looking at all the dromaeosaur literature, trying to figure out their distributions, when they were appearing and where, and I ran across this thing in the publication that just kind of blew my mind. So the biggest raptor is a mysterious giant dromaeosaur from the late Cretaceous of Uzbekistan. And it's known from just this single bone. It seems like a lot to hang on a single bone, but bear with me here. It's a pretty extraordinary animal. So it comes from the Bisekti Formation of Kazakhstan. No, Uzbekistan. Sorry, I'm mixing up my stands there. And it's Turonian in age. The Bisekti Formation has previously produced a number of really interesting things. A primitive horned dinosaur called Tyrannoceratops, which is a primitive relative of things like Triceratops. It has the small, late surviving Carcharodontosaur, the Legbegosaurus, I'm probably mispronouncing that, a small tyrannosaur called Timurlangia, a small raptor called Idomyrus, which is likely a dromaeosaurine, but the top predator of this fauna was likely a giant dromaeosaur. So several years ago, a paper was published describing new dromaeosaur remains from the Bisekti Formation. They described a number of different bones, which they attributed to the raptor Idomyrus. One of the elements they described is this bone, and it's a dromaeosaur pedal phalanx 2 of digit 2. This is the bone that bears that modified sickle claw in animals like Velociraptor and Deinonychus. It's very distinctive. It's short, it's robust. It has a very large articulation for the talon, to hold that talon, that sickle claw, the slashing claw. At the end, the base has this long articular heel. And this comes back and allows that claw to be retracted so it can retract that sickle claw and hold it clear of the ground. So this is all classic dromaeosaur. So what's the problem with this animal? Well, the problem is the sheer insane size of this thing. It is absolutely enormous. Here it is. I put these things to scale. I put it next to Deinonychus. Deinonychus is a fairly large animal. Again, it's about 10 feet long, and it's about twice the size. This is just an absolute monster. So what is this thing? Well, kind of a hint here is that it's much more highly modified. There's a very different shape from what you see in Deinonychus. Deinonychus has the primitive shape for the dromaeosaur pedal phalanx 2 of digit 2. What you'll see is it compares a lot better with a Chelabator. It's almost a dead ringer. Note the extremely short, robust shaft of the phalanx. Note the relatively small distal articulation. Note the very large proximal articulation. All these features are typical of a chelabator. And if you found this thing in the same horizon as a chelabator, you'd probably just assume they're the exact same thing. So it's almost identical, except it's much, much larger. It's something like, I measured it something about 132% the length of a chelabator, about a third larger. I mean, and a chelabator is a big animal. So this animal is just absolutely just staggeringly ginormous. If we scale up a reconstruction of a chelabator, we scale it up by 132% or whatever, we end up with a dromaeosaur that is 6.6 meters long or 22 feet. That's about 10% longer than Utah Raptor. And it would weigh just over 1,000 kilograms, which is, substantially heavier than any estimates for Utah Raptor. This would make this animal the largest known dromaeosaur that we've seen so far, which is pretty cool, right? I think that's pretty amazing. Here we have this animal to scale with other dromaeosaurs, and you can see just how big this thing gets compared to these other animals. How reliable is this? I mean, it's just one bone. Well, pretty much every single bone in the body of a dinosaur can be diagnosed to family and often a subfamily. If you sit down with the fossils and compare everything and really learn the details, the ins and outs, the anatomy, almost everything is highly diagnostic to a relatively low taxonomic level. I mean, it might not get you to species, but typically you can get to family or subfamily from almost any bone, the femur or a metatarsal or a phalanx like this. And the Dromaeosaur digit 2, which carries that big slashing claw, is really highly specialized. Nothing else really looks like this. These are very, very distinctive bones. It can't be, we're not mistaking this for something else, I don't think. And then the digit 2 in Utah Raptorines is even more specialized. So I think this idea is pretty secure. And then there's just kind of what I call the dead ringer principle. You put it next to this other thing, it's a dead ringer. Don't overthink it. If it looks identical to this other thing in all these little subtle ways, even if you don't sit down there and enumerate every single little character, even if you don't do some complex analysis, if it's a dead ringer, it's probably the same thing. Unfortunately, so while I think at some level it's highly diagnostic as a dromaeosaurid and a Utah Raptorine, it's too fragmentary to actually diagnose a species. We can't put a name on it. I guess if you want to give it a name, you could call it the Uzbek raptor. So there's something out there which is much larger than anything else we've ever seen, but all we have of it is this single bone. This tells us something about how incomplete the fossil record is. It's really incomplete. If our only record of these giant things, these giant animals, and this world record specimen is just this single isolated bone, I mean, we're working with scraps. We're really missing a lot, which makes you wonder what else is out there that we were missing. How big would the biggest dromaeosaur have been? Over time, as we've gotten a better understanding of the fossil record, we have found larger and larger dromaeosaurs. We started out with relatively small animals like Velociraptor and Dromaeosaurus. Then we found Deinonychus, a bit bigger. Then we found Utah Raptor, which is really big. Then more big animals like a chelabator, Dakota Raptor, Austroraptor, and now this monster. So there's a trend towards finding larger and larger dromaeosaurs over time. I predict if we extrapolate out this trend line, sometime in the next 100 years, we will find a 100-foot-long dromaeosaur. Obviously not. I mean, that's a bit of a bit of an exaggeration, but I think you can argue that we are gradually, as we find more and more, we're pushing the size range of this group up, and we're finding larger and larger members. And I think that will continue in the future. So it raises a question like, how big is the biggest dromaeosaur going to be? It's almost certainly something we haven't seen yet. We are finding less than 1% of all dinosaur species that ever lived, maybe 0.1%. And typically when we find the species, we've got that 1% or less of all species. When we find that dinosaur species, we are finding average size members of them. Dakota Raptor is probably an average size member of its species because on average, that's what you tend to find. The average and the extremes you find far less commonly. So if you found more and more Dakota Raptors, maybe you would find a world record class specimen, but it's unlikely that the one specimen we have is the world record class outlier. So it's unlikely, of course, that there is a 100-foot long Dromaeosaur out there, probably not even a 40-foot long Dromaeosaur. But it's not inconceivable that somewhere out there there's a 25-foot long, a 30-foot long Dromaeosaur weighing a couple of tons and getting up to the size of some of these smaller Tyrannosaurs. But it's not impossible. So I think the discovery curve, it'll probably kind of go up over time and sort of level out and it sort of hits an asymptote. I don't think it's going to keep going up and up forever, the size of these animals, but it'll increase more slowly and slowly over time, and we'll get closer and closer and closer to finding the largest Dromaeosaur and the largest specimen of the largest Dromaeosaur, but we will never get there. The largest animal is probably something we'll never find, but we might get closer in the next, who knows, 20 years, 10 years, in 5 years, something new might turn up. So why does this matter as a scientist, besides just like, well, geez, raptors they're cool animals? Well, they are. I'm going to veer away a bit from talking about big dinosaurs and talk instead about fragmentary dinosaurs. We attach a lot of importance to these highly complete skeletons of animals like Velociraptor, these beautiful articulated Velociraptor skeletons from the dunes of the Gobi, or Deinonychus. And obviously these are important. They give us a very complete picture of these animals. And that's really important to understand the biology of these animals, how do they live, and also their evolution. We have a detailed picture of the anatomy that allowed us to compare these animals to Archaeopteryx. And that's what really kind of solved the mystery of bird origins, was having complete skeletons of these animals to compare back to. So knowing the skeleton helps us understand biology. It helps us understand evolutionary relationships. But complete remains are really, really rare. Isolated bones are going to be orders of magnitude more common. Isolated bones and teeth. For every good skeleton out there, for every beautiful articulated Velociraptor, there might be 100 isolated bones and 1,000 teeth. And these things are important. They provide a different kind of information. They might not provide us the same quality of information, obviously, but it provides a quantity of information because they're abundant. So, and that's useful and that's important. If you want to know something like distribution, what was the first raptor? What was the last raptor? What's their geographic distribution? Where do they live? Their diversity. Working with these fragmentary remains just gives you a far more detailed picture of this group, its diversity, its evolution, its ecology. Yeah, and obviously it's a lot more challenging to work with. I would much rather work with a complete skeleton than a single toe bone. I mean, obviously, but in paleontology, you kind of go with what you got. You got to work with what you have. You got to work with the dinosaurs you have and not the dinosaurs you wish you have. You just sit around doing nothing all day long. So it is easy to get this wrong sometimes. Dromaeosaur teeth kind of look like all smile theropod teeth. And there are a lot of reports of Dromaeosaur teeth that are some other lineage, like little Abelisaurs from Africa or whatever the heck. So yeah, you can get it wrong sometimes. That's not a reason not to do it. It just means you have to be cautious in your interpretations and really do your homework and know what you're talking about, especially with the teeth, because there's so few characters for those things. A little easier with the bones. But yeah, it's hard, but I think it's rewarding just because it's giving you information that, we otherwise just wouldn't have. It gives us these really important insights. Our record of Dromaeosaurs from the late Cretaceous of Africa is just isolated bones. If we didn't look at these isolated bones, we wouldn't even know Dromaeosaurs were there in the late Cretaceous. Likewise, there's this animal called Velociraptor, a Dromaeosaur of some sort, possibly an Unulagian, from the late Cretaceous of Europe. It's known by isolated remains, but these are important in telling us that Dromaeosaurs were there and something about the affinities of these Dromaeosaurs. So, yeah, these animals are really fragmentary, but they dramatically extend the range of Dromaeosaurs in late Cretaceous. They extend their geographic record to 2 additional continents. We wouldn't know they were there if we only studied the highly complete articulated stuff. Another animal that extends our knowledge of Dromaeosaurs is potentially this little animal called Nuthetes destructor that was named by Owen. It's known from, I think, a jaw or two and a bunch of isolated teeth. But if it is a dromaeosaur, and that's a bit debated, but if it's a dromaeosaur, it's one of the oldest known dromaeosaurs at around 140, 145 million years ago. This is at the very base of the Cretaceous. And if we're seeing dromaeosaurs at the very base of the Cretaceous, that implies they're probably hanging out somewhere in the Jurassic, and we just haven't recognized them yet. So it's kind of pushing back this dromaeosaur origin potentially into the Jurassic. This is an important range extension. So in addition to geographic extensions, range extensions, we have stratigraphic range extensions for these animals that are made possible by fragmentary remains. So you have increased understanding of size distributions, geographic distributions, and stratigraphic distributions. Hesperonychus is one of these stratigraphic range extensions. This is a group that was otherwise known just from the early Cretaceous of China. And we found these specialized small dromaeosaurs, these microraptorines, were also in the late Cretaceous of North America alongside and things tyrannosaurs. So it shows that we have these small cat-sized predatory dromaeosaurs coexisting alongside these giant tyrannosaurs. And this helps us understand the ecosystem structure of the late Cretaceous. And these, unsexy isolated remains, these fragmentary remains, give us a far fuller picture of the world of the dinosaurs, the Cretaceous diversity, and its evolution and extinction. So, yeah, beautiful skeletons of Deinonychus and Velociraptor have helped us understand the biology and evolution of the dromaeosaurs, but isolated remains just give us this far fuller, more detailed picture of when and where dromaeosaurs live, their sizes, their roles in the ecosystem, and they give us, just through their sheer quantity, a much more detailed picture of what's going on with this animal, this group. So it's not just the dromaeosaurs, of course. Almost any fossil group you will look at, you're going to find important extensions of geographic range and stratigraphic range and diversity coming from relatively isolated or scrappy remains. Humans are an example of this, a really good example, in fact, of very important advances coming from very fragmentary remains. The discovery of the Denisovans, a distinct lineage, a distinct species of a human that we didn't know existed, came from a single finger bone and a tooth. Now, in this case, they were able to sequence the DNA, which we can't really do with our isolated remains. But it tells you that the completeness of the remains are very different from its scientific importance. And this was scientifically very, very important material, even though it was very fragmentary. The earliest known record of Homo sapiens, modern Homo sapiens, crown group Homo sapiens in the world may come from Mumba Rock Shelter in Tanzania, and it consists of just a couple molars, that's all. But that's by far the oldest record of modern humans, if those are in fact modern humans. And again, that kind of tells you the challenges of dealing with these remains. Exactly what they are is a little bit unclear, but these are potentially very, very important remains. So it's not just dinosaurs, it's not just dromaeosaurs, whether you're working on hominin evolution or mammal evolution or whatever, the isolated remains can give you really important insights. And if you just look at the really complete stuff, you're just going to miss all these things. The scraps give us this far more complete picture of the fossil record. They give us the oldest record of lineages, the youngest occurrence of lineages. They expand our understanding of biogeography, the smallest and biggest members of the group. And statistically, almost always the outliers are going to be more fragmentary stuff because there's just more of them. The largest dromaeosaur that we have is more likely to be a fragmentary specimen just because we have tons of fragmentary stuff and we have a very poor sample of complete things. So the sheer abundance of these remains allows us to expand the record in a way that restricting it to these beautiful skulls and beautiful skeletons, we can't do the same things that we do with the fragmentary remains. So I think these little bits these little isolated fossils are key to understanding the big picture. Each one is a little data point, giving us a bit more insight into larger patterns of evolution and diversity. Isolated stuff gives us quantity, and quantity has a quality all its own. And also, I honestly think they're just kind of fun. Yeah, they're hard to work with. It's a challenge, but it's a puzzle. It's like paleontology on hard mode, like a like, some word puzzle or Scrabble or something, trying to make something out of these little remains and figure out what the heck you have. It's about the most difficult paleontology you can do. And also, they're kind of well mysterious. They're little hints, little, you know, scraps hinting at some larger picture, at things we don't know. And you sort of have to use your imagination to figure out what's going on. So, yeah, I think maybe the big thing these isolated remains tell us is that we just haven't found everything yet. We don't have a skeleton for one of these giant raptors. We may never. There were likely other dromaeosaurs out there, even larger than the Uzbek giant. Statistically, it is unlikely that we have found the largest individual of the largest species that ever existed. I'd be speculating if I said that raptors got 8, 9, or 10 meters long, but it's not speculative to say that they almost certainly got bigger than the biggest raptor we now know of, which is the thing from the Bisekti Formation. There is a lot we don't know and maybe never will. On the other hand, there's a lot we will discover in the not too distant future. And fragmentary remains, by providing a larger sample to study, show us just how much there is left for us to discover.